Hello, my name is Martin Lipscomb, and today I talk to Professor and Vice-Chancellor Dawn Freshwater. Dawn became the first female Vice-Chancellor at Auckland University, New Zealand, 2 days before the coronavirus lockdown came into effect. So, while altered working practices have created new challenges and stresses for everyone, imagine heading up and leading a billion-dollar enterprise from the kitchen table. That's on-the-job training. Before moving to Auckland, Dawn was the first female Vice-Chancellor at Western University in Australia. Indeed, she was the first female VC in Australia, full stop. And in addition, she was the first female chair of the prestigious Australian Group of 8 universities. Prior to that, Professor Freshwater was Pro-Vice-Chancellor at Leeds University in the UK. And while the posts and the positions that she has held would, in this context, be somewhat onerous to list, I would just note here that she has been editor of the Journal of Psychiatric Health Nursing. Now, atop these accomplishments, Dawn's research is no less impressive. She has her name on the spines of 6 books, and she has authored considerably more papers than most other scholars can muster who don't have her leadership responsibilities. Today, we're going to talk about a 2017 commentary that Dawn published in the Journal of Research in Nursing, titled Perspectives, Reciprocity and Integration in Nursing and Mixed Methods Research. This commentary, or editorial, introduced a special issue of the journal, and Dawn was invited to introduce the issue because she has a long-standing and deep-rooted interest in mixed methods research, and indeed methodological matters more generally. And what struck me about this piece is that it contains the following assertion, to quote, "As a profession, we are perhaps not yet in the space of formally being able to track and evaluate the utility and translation of research findings in clinical practice back to the methodological choices made." Dawn, please, would you outline and describe the commentary, and could you comment on this fascinating and curious statement?
Thank you, Martin, and I'm happy to do that and delighted to be asked to be part of this series. So I was asked to prepare this commentary in the context of the edited version of the mixed methods papers in the Journal of Research in Nursing, actually because I was also editor at the time of Mixed Methods Journal, the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, and right in the middle of paradigm wars. And I'll come to that in a moment. But particularly of interest to myself and to many of my colleagues at the time, because we're talking 3 years ago, which of course is not actually a long time ago, but it is in the context of the development of methods and theories and and actually discourse around paradigm. We were very interested in the translation and application of research findings in nursing, across nursing practice, and particularly the impact on nursing care on patient-centered outcomes. And so there were lots of questions being asked at the time around the value and the impact of nursing research. And the commentary actually addresses some of this. So I began by talking about what is now commonly known as thinking about ourselves, particularly in higher education, as knowledge organizations, and the way in which we generate data and research outcomes, thinking about the way in which you contribute to knowledge, informing not only practices, but also, of course, evidence that supports policy and generating further research questions. And I made quite a bold statement in this commentary at the time, which was that knowledge production was an entrepreneurial activity, and something that I don't think that we considered very much about the way in which we were entrepreneurial and research as an entrepreneurial activity at the time in terms of nursing and what we were doing in nursing research and patient outcomes. From a mixed methods research point of view, I was very curious to watch the development of a variety of perspectives and paradigms across the mixed methods research literature, and the ways in which those paradigm wars, initially the qualitative quantitative paradigm wars, which sort of came together through pragmatism, were eventually becoming more reciprocal. So working together, less boundaried, ways of trying to address limitations in research and research outcomes. So a real pulling together of the ways in which we approach research through methods in order to really address better outcomes. And I was curious as I watched that development. And of course, as you saw from the commentary, at the time, there was quite a number of people focused on the differences between the dialectic, the pragmatic, and critical realism, and more developments since then. So not just the performative framework around the paradigms, but transformative paradigm now with Donna Merton's work that's come out of that. So lots of flexibility in the way in which we could think about approaches to research. For me, I was more interested really in how we thought about the presentation of findings, the representation of findings, and the way in which the architecture of our thinking was laid bare through the presentation of our findings and the representation of findings, and the way in which that then contributed to the ongoing narrative and discourse around the development of nursing research, and whether or not we were really able to tie back findings, their application and translation of those findings in terms of patient outcomes, back to methodological choices. And that's really where that statement comes from, because I wasn't really sure that as a profession, so let me just land on some of those words, Martin, in that statement. Profession is a contested statement in and of itself. And then I talk about formally being able to track back and evaluate. Why do I land on that word formally? Because if we go back to people like Barbara Carper and Patricia Benner and think about the notion of formal knowledge in the context of how we're developing our knowledge base through experience to become experts, again, another contested statement, that if we think about formally tracking back, I believe we were still, and probably are a bit still, quite novice in the way in which we formally track and evaluate the utility and translation of our research and its application in clinical practice back to methodological choices. So do we really fundamentally understand the philosophical framework that we've chosen within that context, the ethical framework, how reality is perceived, how knowledge is generated, and what systematic inquiry comes out of that philosophical framework? Do we really track back the outcomes of our research in that very formal way? And that's what that statement was really asking. And if we really wanted to include multiple viewpoints, multiple ways of knowing, including those of our participants, namely the patients primarily, in that knowledge generation to legitimize it, then could we really argue that we were doing that in a way that really we fundamentally understood and precisely understood the definitions of our methodological choices? So I think I'll leave it there because I'm sure there are questions, Martin,
Okay.
but hopefully that just gives you a sense of where I was coming from.
Thank you. So I would like to ask you a question which explores that a little bit further. Now, as you've mentioned, your commentary identifies three main paradigms in mixed methods research, which you label dialectic, pragmatic, and critical realist. And you also note a fourth, the performative, it's gaining traction. And each of these paradigms rests on or makes use of different sets of grounding assumptions. And so my question to you is, does this matter? I note that in your view, all of these paradigms are, to quote, complementary, synergistic, and connected. I think that might be disputed. Nonetheless, if or insofar as a paradigm provides ideational, justificational cover to a research tradition or approach, does it matter what implications should be drawn if in nursing, if in healthcare research more generally, competing paradigms exist? more specifically from a reader's perspective, from the vantage of someone who wanted to use mixed methods results. Is it sensible to assume that findings deriving from or associated with different paradigms are all equally useful, equally informative? Or, if different paradigms are differentially useful, would it be more sensible to look only at research findings emanating from the paradigm which, in the reader's view, was the most defensible in a given context? And this very much, I think, ties back to your comments regarding tracking and evaluating methodological choices.
Yes, so I think, Martin, what's really interesting is that if you go back and look at the different ways in which the paradigms are framed within the literature and the arguments that have been made, and I have argued that each of the existing paradigms, and actually I would argue those that have been developed since the commentary and the thinking that's been developed around those paradigms since the commentary, still have relevance to and are useful in the service of nursing inquiry. But I think it's an interesting question that you raise, because when I talk about relevance and service to nursing inquiry, let me start from this position, which is it okay, for example, to say that a particular paradigm has relevance if its relevance is to help us to understand that it is not helpful in the service of nursing inquiry? So that's an interesting question for me. So when I talk about relevance, we might think about it being relevant in the context of helping us to define what it is and is not relevant, what's useful, what is pragmatic, for example, and what may or may not lead to some advancement in terms of knowledge that helps us to think differently about service delivery models, for example. So I think we have to sort of pull back a bit and ask those questions around what does that mean? And of course, at the time I was talking about relevance in the context of impactful and translatable research outcomes. And as time goes on, we're able to reflect back on our own writings and our own research and ask ourselves, what did I mean then? Now, of course, I can look at that and think, what did I mean when I said relevance to? And relevant in the context of this now being something that we can put to one side. So one might ask in the context of your question, are placebos relevant when we know that they are placebos? Well, placebos are relevant precisely because they help us to understand the relevance of the alternative. And so that's not necessarily answering the question directly, but it presents a slightly different perspective on the notion of relevance. The reason I frame that as a starting point is because for all researchers, even those of you that are engaged in postgraduate studies and beginning to learn the craft of research, we have to learn about what to dismiss along the way, why we're dismissing it, and why it may provide some contextual relevance in terms of what decisions we're making, in terms of the choices of other alternative approaches. So I think that's one comment in response to the question that you're asking. Are all of these defensible? Well, of course, in the literature, they are defensible if you take the perspectives of dialectical research, the pragmatists, and then think about the way in which constructivists and the critical realists are arguing that there is some sort of objectivity, and objectivity which may be approximate, but nevertheless arguing for some form of objectivity. They're all defensible if we take the stance from which the position is argued. I think the more interesting question for me is if we look at them all in context and so that means taking them all from a pragmatic perspective. So applying a pragmatic lens to dialectics, applying a pragmatic lens to critical realism, and to now transformative and performative. If we thought about that from a pragmatic point of view, then they all have some form of application. They all have some form of limitation. They are all able to offer some perspective on nursing practice, nursing theory, patient outcomes, service delivery. And from that point of view, they are all defensible. Whether they're all equal or not, I think is, in my view, is probably the answer is no, not. But they can all be used persuasively to help us to think about the application of findings from a particular perspective.
I don't think I disagree with you in any fundamental way. It's just that when we think about pragmatism and critical realism, the two of the paradigms that I'm more familiar with, and it's immediately obvious that there are so many different types of pragmatism that that they don't always line up or cohere at all. And equally with critical realism, there are so many versions of that thing. I'm not entirely sure that because they can be in contrast or contradiction to each other, I think you've got to be really careful about why you're choosing a particular approach to research, because if you're not clear about, for example, the type of pragmatism that you're picking up and using, you could quite easily, inadvertently or accidentally, make statements which don't fall within that way of looking at the world. And that's why I think it's so important that we think these things through. And at the same time, the danger is you just go down a rabbit hole of so many differences and it becomes silly, whereas oftentimes you can make perfectly sensible statements. Let me ask you another question.
So Martin, if I might just, sorry to interrupt you there, but I might just say, well, we're at the risk of furious agreement with each other, because I think what you're saying actually relates to the contentious statement that you pulled out, which is we really need to understand our starting point, which for me requires quite a lot of in-depth knowledge and awareness of the different paradigms, of epistemology, ontology, of understanding what it is that we're attempting to in terms of attempting to define. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the risk with pragmatism, which is socially useful knowledge, let's think about it in that context, socially useful knowledge, which might help with injustices and addressing inequalities, might, I use that term loosely, but you're right, it is essentially around discourse and communication. And when we think about communication, the nature of communication is contradictory because we're human. So in that context, it speaks to the human condition, which is why I feel in some ways quite attracted to it. But in the same light, I absolutely, I think fundamentally in that statement, I'm saying, and let's be, and I use this word again, that is again a contestable, let's be really conscious about the choices we're making and ensure that our statements are really underpinned by a degree of deliberatism in those statements. And of course, people will pick out the areas that we haven't necessarily thought about, but we have to have, there's a project here which is a recurring deepening of that knowing.
Yes, and again, the risk of just agreeing, which is very dull. When people talk about, and stick with pragmatism for the example, just for the point of view example, there are so many pragmatisms. You could have Richard Rorty at one end, and you could have people like, I'm going to mispronounce his surname now, but Nicholas Reicher at the other end, who would both claim the mantle of pragmatism, but they are so far apart, it'd be difficult for them to sit where they both alive together, because they're just so different. And yet nurses want to use these types of ideas for concrete, practical ends. And often nurse researchers haven't been prepared, because not for any fault of their own, but to get down and dirty with that level of detail that perhaps would be necessary to truly understand these things. Now, it's not a criticism of any particular research, any particular nurse researcher. It's just the nature of the training that we tend to go through and our orientation to practice. So I think there is a tension there between the thing which we agree on, which is the need to be clear and precise and to understand the perspective you're using, and the actual practical the requirements that would be necessary to pull that off, and that's a difficult thing. Okay, let me ask you another question, and this one relates to ethics. Now, your commentary, like all of your writings, or many of your writings, stress the place and the importance of ethics in research practice. For example, you begin the piece by stating that just as clinical nurses aim to engage compassionately and empathetically with those in their charge, so researchers should evidence the same principles in their own work. Now, I fully and wholeheartedly agree with you. No quibbles, no objections, but to play devil's advocate, if researchers have as their primary objective the creation or the revealing of new knowledge and understandings, while we might hope that compassion and empathy characterize their interactions with participants or subjects, must these considerations always typify those interactions? If we can envisage any scenario or situation in which discounting these goods leads to the creation or revealing of important knowledge and understanding that wouldn't be achieved had compassion and empathy been considered, and when in discounting these goods no substantive harm ensues, might on consequentialist grounds compassion and empathy be abandoned? And I appreciate that the phrase no substantive harm is clearly question begging. However, to simplify matters, let's suppose that, for example, deception best serves research aims, and deception might be considered unempathetic from the perspective of participants. Might deception be allowed?
Mm-hmm. Well, I find that a really fascinating question, Martin, because I just wonder to what extent there is ever really any freedom from self-deception anyway. And if we think about that, as researchers, as professionals, as practitioners, the degree to which we do deceive ourselves around our intentions, whilst we may not be able to quantify that, I mean, it's never going to be zero. There is always a degree of self-deception, and so when I talk about these sorts of ethics, the empathic resonance that you're talking about in terms of conducting research, I think about intention, and I think knowing and understanding, reflecting on the intention, is a really key aspect of conducting any interaction. So not just research interaction, but any interaction where we're working with vulnerable people. And, you know, very often we are working with vulnerable people in our clinical practices. And that might include students also. So let's bring that one to the fore. And so the question is, you know, if we using deception, but knowing the intent in terms of the outcome is actually one which is well intended and might lead to improved outcomes and improved quality of life, is that deception acceptable? I think that's partly the question that is sort of embedded in what you're asking. And it feels a bit like some of the questions around experiments in the past that we could refer to, in which we know that you know, the social experiments have led to some very traumatic outcomes for people, actually, because I think of you know, an intent that perhaps was not necessarily thought through to its logical consequences. And so I think for me, we're never going to be able to fully bring to the surface or fully rehearse through to the logical consequences what might happen in an unintended way. And we'll perhaps never know, Martin, for those of us that have been involved in research with patients in many different ways, we'll perhaps never know actually fully, if we created or caused any harm, we may know that we didn't create substantive harm. But if we think about every interaction, and I talk now as somebody with mental health in my background, and so most of my research in that area and working with young offenders in prisons and people who were clearly had suicidal ideation, if we think about every interaction in that context, even a research interview, every interaction is an intervention. And if we approach the research experience as an intervention, no matter what it is, and understand our intention in that regard, and think that through in a very carefully considered way and work with the participant in as much of an open and transparent way as possible, then isn't that the best we can do? And maybe that's good enough from a Winnicottian point of view, but it may not be perfect. So, you know, we might ask ourselves, if somebody consents to be part of a research study, I go back to my placebo example. If somebody consents to be part of a research study where they know that there's a possibility of receiving a placebo, and they consent to that, is that deception? It's not, but you know, if they don't know that there's going to be a placebo, but they understand that the intent of the study is to trial different approaches, and there may be some that make no difference, or you know, are not necessarily as influential as others. Are we in that sort of scenario deceiving? So I think that, you know, this is a really nutty question, and one which, from a philosophical point of view, has ethics at its heart, to do no harm, and to understand that even with the intent to do no harm, there may be times when on the route to achieving the intended outcome, some harm may be done.
Okay. One last question. I might have misread your commentary slightly, but do you think in some, if not all instances, that mixed methods research has advantages over qualitative and quantitative research in allowing or encouraging those forms of ethical practice that you valorize?
Yes, I think what I'd say in very quick summary to that is that if we're able to find ways of pulling forward and examining, interrogating, tickling, troubling all the limitations, or at least as many of the limitations of our different ways of knowing as possible, and bringing that to the fore, and then understanding at a meta level the gaps and the limitations of pulling that together, those different ways of knowing, then I think that there is, at least to my mind and in my experience, some benefit of doing that in terms of serving that ethical understanding that I've been referring to.
Dawn, let's wrap it up there. That was really interesting. Thank you very much for your time. It's always nice talking to you. Again, thank you for your time.